Welcome to this lecture on feminist criticism. As you are aware, we are in a series of lectures brought under the broad aegis of English language and literature. This course is being recorded under the aegis of the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, an initiative by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. We are in the fourth module of the series of lectures, and we have already been through a few lectures on literary criticism, and you will recall that the last lecture was on Marxist literary criticism, and today we are going to devote this lecture to feminist criticism. Let me begin by saying here at the beginning of this lecture that this lecture is not an advanced level lecture. This lecture is going to talk broadly about feminist criticism, beginning with the feminist movement, and will bring to you a few core concepts in feminist literary criticism. As you are also aware, these lectures are being brought to you to a broad spectrum of viewers, all right, but the target audience comprises students in engineering colleges for whom the humanities and social sciences subjects are brought as electives. Okay, so let's do a recap first of what we did in our last lecture, which was devoted to Marxist literary criticism. And you will recall that historical materialism is one of the important, how should I put it, one of the important descriptive and theoretical terms used to, used to talk about Marxism. Okay, so why do we call it historical materialism? We found that the two most important questions, or rather the two core questions asked here are: A, how are societies organized and structured, and how do societies develop and change? Okay, so you will note here that A is the structure of societies. Okay, if you have to make sense of societies, we first have to look at the way they are organized and structured, and second, we have to account, we know that all societies change, we have to then account for why social change happens, why societies evolve from one stage to the other. Then we found that even as we talk about Marxist literary criticism, okay, we cannot do without the two perhaps most important terms given to us by Karl Marx, that is the base, the economic base, and the superstructure, and we placed art in the superstructure, okay, along with other components like consciousness, religion, education, family, and the legal system. And then we said, after Karl Marx, that the base, the economic base, which comprises the relations of production and the forces of production, determine, without being deterministic, okay, determine the features or characteristics or nature of the components of the superstructure, which also meant that literary texts would be determined by the economic base of the period in which they were written. Of course, it is not as simplistic as it sounds, right? There are different ways in which literary texts, creative writers will engage, okay, with different elements of both the base and the superstructure. Their responses, their reactions would take different forms. In some cases, we would find that a literary text would be with, right, the dominant ideologies of its time, whereas another literary text may quite severely critique, okay, the status quo of the times concerned. Okay. So, these are the two terms we found we cannot do without when we talk about literary criticism. We cannot brush them aside as sort of clearly or purely Marxist concepts or concepts from political science or sociology. Okay. Then we saw a quotation from Plekhanov, okay, who said very rightly that the social mentality of an age is conditioned by that age's social relations. Okay. And where did we come across the word social relations? Remember, in the previous slide we came across relations of production or social relations as being part of the economic base. So, the social mentality, right, of an age will be conditioned. Look at the word condition. Okay, he rightly uses the word condition because we are not talking about a deterministic causal, okay, of a pure causality. The social relations of an age will be conditioned by that age's social social mentality will be conditioned by that age's social relations. And then he says this is nowhere quite as evident as in the history of art and literature. Okay. This changing social mentality or the fact, this conditioning, okay, of social mentality by social relations is, according to Plekhanov, the most evident or is indicated or is most evident, as he uses the word, most evident in the history of art and literature. That is, the entire history of art or the entire history of literature may be read as changing mentalities, changing social mentalities, okay, given changing social relations. Okay. So, this really is the crux of Marxist literary criticism. Then we also saw this. We said that, well, after we have known the basic tenets of Marxism, of historical materialism that are useful for us as literary scholars, then what is the method by which we analyze a text or by which we analyze a literary period or a literary movement? Okay. So, here are some of the examples which I have taken from several from several authors. For instance, let us look at the first question. You may ask a question like, what ideology or ideologies does the text or literary movement reinforce? Does it reinforce the dominant ideology? Let us look at this quickly, because we have already talked about this in the last lecture. In what ways does the text reveal and invite us to attest to or to condemn the ideology? And how far is the text ideologically straightforward or conflicted, or is how far is it propagandist? So, these are, and other points are, these are some of the things that you may ask of a text if you are planning to do a Marxist literary analysis. Okay, fine. So, now we will move on to the topic of discussion, our topic of discussion today, that is feminist criticism. And of course, feminist criticism is a very well established field, and there are so many textbooks, so many handbooks, so many critical anthologies that you may use for an understanding of feminist literary criticism. What I have done here is I have selected a few texts so that my lecture draws upon these, right, and I shall be quoting from these, also using examples. So, our first book is Wilfred Guerin's A Handbook of Critical Approaches to Literature. Then Malpass and Paul Wake's The Routledge Companion to Critical Theory, the essay by Susan Heckman in this collection entitled Feminism. That is the text that we are taking up. And another book that has been with us in all our lectures, almost all our lectures, that is Pramod K. Nair's Contemporary Literary and Cultural Theory, and two more books which would help us point to a post-feminist approach, and among which we find Judith Butler's Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter to be useful for our purposes. Okay. Again, let me remind you, these are by no means the text or the only text that is that you may read. Okay. There are several other books, and we will first begin by reading from the Routledge Companion to Critical Theory. So, let us now read From the Routledge Companion to Critical Theory. As I had mentioned, this essay is by Susan Heckman entitled Feminism. Now, let us look at this carefully. Since its inception, feminism has passed through a number of different stages. This is what is very important. We need to keep in mind that feminism is not temporally or over time a homogeneous discourse or a homogeneous analytical tool, okay, for literary or cultural analysis. Nor is it spatially, that is over different different geographical spaces and nations and states. Feminism is not homogeneous, right? It is important for us to note that today there are what we may call various feminisms. Like we say, there are various Englishes, okay, in the world. So also there are various feminisms, okay. There are various feminist discourses, right, that talk about the issue of women and gender from various perspectives, and these have also no doubt enriched the whole field of feminist studies. Okay. So, with Heckman we come to learn right at the beginning that feminism is not to be taken as a temporally and spatially homogeneous term. Okay. So, again, since its inception, it has passed through a number of different stages. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, liberal feminism, look, now these are important terms, okay, liberal feminism and socialist feminism allied feminism with the dominant political theories of the day. So, among the early, now when I say early, it does not mean that these schools or these approaches in feminism and feminist literary theory, that I do not mean or not mean in any way to suggest that these are old theories and that they are not relevant today. Okay. However, we trace it from the 19th century and early 20th century, and we say that there were basically two schools, the liberal feminist school and the socialist feminist school, which the social feminist school draws obviously from draws its main analytical tools from socialism or from Marxism, okay, and these were allied. I mean, they were not separated really, these were allied to the general political theories of their time. Do you follow? Okay. For instance, socialist feminism would draw its discourse, okay, by seeing women in terms of a class, okay, would consider women to be analogous to the working class, for instance, to an exploited class, and the discourse would be generally built around this political focus, okay, of looking at women as akin to an oppressed class. Okay. So, then Heckman goes on to say, beginning in the 1960s, however, feminists developed approaches that did not depend on male defined theories. Now, what she suggests here, she seems to suggest here that the liberal approaches or the Marxist approaches were basically theories that were made from, so to speak, already established discourses which she calls male defined theories. For instance, then you already have theories and you just simply have to see women in the light of, say, Marxist feminism, in the light of an oppressed class, right. So, then she goes on to say radical feminism, psychoanalytic feminism, the feminisms, now look at this word, the feminisms of women of color and postmodern feminism are attempts to develop analysis of women's role in society from a woman's perspective. This is very important. Okay. There seems now to be, beginning from the middle of the 20th century, there seems to be a change, a plethora of different ways of sort of doing feminism, for instance, radical feminism or postmodern feminism or psychoanalytic feminism, which in the case of psychoanalytic feminist criticism, moving away from a basic Freudian model, okay, to a model in which we find women talking about from a psychoanalytic perspective, which differs from the older Freudian model, for instance, of the castration anxiety model, for instance. Okay, so these are rereadings of Freud in the psychoanalytic domain. So these feminisms, okay, radical, postmodern, psychoanalytic, etc., are at once feminist movements, social political feminist movements that also sort of spawned different critical or feminisms with different critical shades, each being different from the other. This really, if you look at it carefully and if you go on to read in these areas, are extremely rich, okay, in their nuanced differences, both nuanced and both quite forthrightly political, okay, differences among themselves. Okay. So again, radical, psychoanalytic, for instance, the feminisms of women of color, for instance. Okay. One of the most important things, slogans that were raised was that when you talk about feminism, for a long time, the category woman was read, seen and understood in terms of white middle class women. The problems of women all over the world, okay, were explored, were seen as being akin to the problems of, okay, women, the white Western woman. Okay. So, I would not use the word recent, of course, it has been quite many years. Okay. There have been decades of work where, for instance, the word the word womanism being preferred by many African American or many African women writers, okay, in place of feminism, right. They found the word feminism too sort of separatist, okay, or radical a term, and they tried to or they suggested that the word womanism, okay, would be more appropriate in indicating, right, the cultural situation of black women, for instance. Okay. So, you see that from basically liberal socialist approaches, okay, which drew their terminology, their discourses, their orientations from already established male, what she calls here the male defined theories, okay, came to have different shades and came to have different orientations, for instance, okay, in which a woman's perspective was sought to be upheld. Next, I read on. These approaches analyze how gender is constructed and maintained. This is, I would say, one of the most important sentence here. These approaches analyze how gender is constructed and maintained as one of the central meaning structures of society. Now, quickly let's look at the term gender, right. We in feminist criticism differentiate between the two terms sex and gender. Okay. So, sex, of course, this is no longer the entire story regarding sex and gender, but there was an important differentiation made in I would say the middle of the 20th century. Okay. An important difference was made between sex and gender, and one of the first most important formulations came from a philosopher, a French philosopher who you are, I am sure, at least you have heard of. Okay. This is Simone de Beauvoir in her famous text, The Second Sex. Okay. The second sex obviously refers to women, and in this book there is a there is a famous statement that came to be upheld as sort of the slogan of of feminism of a certain kind, a feminism of a certain you could say a certain time period, right. The statement was that a woman is a woman is not born, but a woman is rather constructed. I'm not quoting her verbatim. Okay, one is not born. That's how it goes. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Okay, so this is the important difference. So you see, sex is of course a biological identity. Okay, and in this the discourse of feminism in this time, usually, today it is not the way we do it, talked about two sexes, male and female. So when a child is born, it is usually a male or a female child. Okay, but as Beauvoir says, one is not born but rather becomes a woman. Beauvoir says that it is social conditioning or social construction, okay, that gives us the other part of the story. That is, if you remember when you read grammar in school, okay, we found we didn't in gender, when we talked about gender in grammar, we didn't use the terms male and female. What were the terms that we used? We used the terms feminine, okay, feminine and masculine, right? There's another one that is neuter or neuter, as some call it, right? So what does this imply? This implies, okay, that gender, sex is, when we talk about sex, we talk about, we should use the terms male and female, and we talk about gender, we should use the terms feminine or masculine. Okay, so feminine and masculine are therefore not physiological, not so much physiological attributes as behavioral attributes. Okay, so feminine kind of behavior is a behavior pattern or a behavior tendency that is not necessarily with us when we are born. Okay, the so called masculine tendencies, according to this schema, is not something that a male child is inherently sort of born with, right? These behavior patterns are patterns to which in which we are brought up in the process of socializations by our parents first, and then that is our family or extended family, and then by our educational system and by society in general. Hence it is said one is not born a woman but becomes one, or we may also say one is not born a male but or man or becomes one. Do you follow? Okay, so what did we learn here? We learned two very important terms here, that is a distinction. By now we of course we call this traditionalist descriptions of sex and gender. Okay, with post feminism this has become a bit more complex. I'll move on to that a while later, but we would still have to acknowledge the fact that this sort of division between sex and gender was a very important theoretical conceptual description for the establishment of feminism as a discourse, okay, for the establishment of feminist literary criticism, for instance. Now in this stage, for instance, if you look at a female character in a novel, what would you do? You would then try to understand, okay, so many things about the character. For instance, her desires, okay, her goals in life or sometimes the lack thereof, okay, her patterns of behavior, her emotions, okay, and you would, as a feminist critic, right, look at all these attributes as emanating from the way the character was socialized. Okay, so you then also look at the way in which the dialogues that are given to the woman character, okay, and then you would place her, in the general milieu, sociocultural milieu of the age, okay, or the era or the period that in which the play or the novel or even the poem is set, and that is how you account for such behavior, right. You also then talk about both male and female characters and their attributes, and also the way the plot runs in the text as the writer's understanding, okay, and or sometimes the writer's intervention in a given socio-cultural milieu. So these are some of the ways in which, okay, feminist criticism was done following right, following the division of sex, or division or our understanding of these two terms, okay, that is separating gender from the main term sex. Do you follow? Okay. So, let us now return to our slides. Fine. The next slide. Here is a very important term, okay, that is patriarchy. This is a term that some of you are aware of, okay. Patriarchy comes from the term, the root term pater, okay. Pater, the root term pater, meaning, some of you may have got it, father, okay. And archy means rule of or rule by, okay. So, patriarchy means rule of the father or rule by the father, okay. Obviously, first in the family, right. So, the father is traditionally understood as the head of the family. The father is traditionally understood as the main source of earning for the family, also the one who sets the rules and regulations of the family. So, the rule by the father is first at a family level, but when feminist critics realized that patriarchy was not simply a family phenomenon, it was a larger, okay, social or even global phenomenon, okay. It also meant not simply the rule by the father or the setting up of rules by the father, okay, the domination of the other members of the family like the wife and the children, okay, by the father. It also suggested that all the norms, rules and regulations, we can even say of most communities, right, most nations in the world are in favor of the male sex. Do you follow? Okay. So, patriarchy then obviously, as you can imagine, became the target, right, of of staunch attack, we may use the word, in radical feminism, in feminist protest movements, okay. And also patriarchy became the discourse, right. It became the discourse by which feminist critics tried to understand, right, the representation of women and of course of male characters in literature. That is, how are women represented in literature? Is a text showing a clearly patriarchal inclination, okay, or is the writer, and in this the works of women writers who were hitherto not an important part of the canon. You remember women writers of the 19th century and even before that in England had to write using pseudonyms, had to write using male names. Do you follow? And in order to hide the fact that these were women writing, okay. So, there were many such cultural phenomena that are also looked into or also studied by feminism, but we have to understand that patriarchy is essentially the discourse that is explored, critiqued and sought to be dismantled by feminists, both feminist movements and feminist literary criticism, okay. Now, what does patriarchy give us? Patriarchy is all about ideologies, and what is an ideology? An ideology may be defined as a worldview, okay, as a worldview, or it is defined as a set of values, for instance, and norms and regulations through which you view the world. All of us have an ideology. Do you understand? So, if we are tremendously religious, then we look at the world and the reasons for our existence therein from a religious point of view or from a religious worldview, and this determines, okay, or conditions even, that is, conditions our values, conditions our beliefs, conditions our desires, and the actions that we take up, right. So, patriarchy is therefore a set of ideologies, a set of worldviews, right. Then obviously, patriarchy is not, when you say it is a rule of the father, patriarchy is also power structures or structures of power in which the male is the norm and the female is the deviant. Patriarchy also has a lot of say, you could say, or a lot of power over how things are represented. You only have to look at popular culture, for instance. You have to look at popular, for instance, popular novels. In our time, the Mills and Boon, romances. If you work on these novels, you find clearly stereotype of woman and even the stereotype of man that is being shown in these novels. So, patriarchy also has a hold, or at least has to till recent times has had a hold over what is represented and how. And finally, obviously, patriarchy has a hold over our material lives. Now, what do we mean by our material lives? Our material lives are the basically the the way we live our lives from an economic point of view, from things that have to do with matter, things have to do with wealth and power. Our material lives are also our everyday lives. For instance, I will give you a very small example. There was a time not very long ago, when food was laid out in a family for the entire family, it was quite the norm, and many quite accepted the fact that the plate or the dish, or what we call the thali in India, for the man, the head of the family, would be much larger than the ones that were given to the other members of the family. You see so many movies of a certain, films of a certain era, in which you always see the man being first served by the woman of the family, and only then after she has looked after the children next, she partakes of whatever is left. So, material lives is not simply big economics that we are talking about, we are also talking about everyday lives, which, as I saw here, also includes the use of certain utensils of certain sizes for certain people, right. So, patriarchy has to do with, as we saw here, ideologies, power structures, representations, and our material lives. Now, when you look at a text, when you look at a novel or a short story or a poem, one of the first things you do when you first begin to do feminist literary criticism at an elementary level, is you try to see the you try to see how patriarchy plays an important part in the setup of the novel, or in the entire, you could say, the entire ambience of the novel. You look at the ideologies, the worldviews that are subscribed to by the characters, and then you find out why certain characters are shown in a certain light. You see the power structures, for instance, family, for instance, you see if there is a family being depicted, you see what the power dynamics are, in that family, and you also see how the writer has represented, how the sexes are represented, what is seen as feminine, appropriately feminine behavior, what is seen as, for instance, the Mills and Boon romances that I talked about, appropriately feminine behavior is very evident, as also appropriately masculine behavior. Do you follow? And you see the material setting, the material, not just the setting, beginning from the props, starting with the props, starting right to the distribution of wealth and labor in the novel, and you will find whether it is a patriarchal novel or whether that novel is a strong a critique of a patriarchal system. So these are some of the ways in which we begin to look at texts in feminist literary criticism. Now, therefore, there are a few names that I would like to bring to you, because these names are important, at least a few of them, in the establishment of the feminist movement and of feminist criticism. And the first name we have to take obviously is the name of the British feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, whose vindication of the rights of women is one of the most famous books, and you can well imagine this book was published in 1798, which is end of the 18th century in England, and Mary Wollstonecraft wrote in her vindication, okay, she called for upholding the rights of women, and she describes in that piece of work. It's a beautiful piece of work in which she describes how women are conditioned, right. This is one of the first and foremost books that one reads, and it's really the beginning of Western feminism, if we may put it that way. Then we come to writers, American writers like Betty Friedan and Kate Millett. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, okay. The Feminine Mystique is a piece of work that shows how the feminine qualities, right, feminine qualities are, women are indoctrinated into the feminine qualities, and how it remains sort of, as the title suggests, a mystique. Okay. Next, Kate Millett's book, Sexual Politics, is one such early book that delved into literature. We went on to talk about the representation and the politics of sexuality, the politics of gender in certain canonized writers, so D.H. Lawrence for instance, and talked about the representation and the sexual politics in those novels. Then we came to another important book by Elaine Showalter. Elaine Showalter's A Literature of Her Own. A literature, okay, of her own. Obviously, those of you who are from literature would understand that it is takes off from another important title by the feminist, by the British writer Virginia Woolf, A Room of Her Own. Okay, so A Literature of Her Own is another landmark book. Published in the 20th century by Elaine Showalter, in which she propounds the theory of gynocriticism. Gynocriticism, obviously the word gyno from gynecology, gynocriticism or woman-centered criticism, okay, in which she talked about various phases of the feminine, the feminist female, for instance, various phases of feminist writing. And then we had another important book, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar's book, The Mad Woman in the Attic. Okay, The Mad Woman in the Attic is one of the is a more detailed exploration, okay, of writing by women. Okay, and the allusion, of course, here is to the repressed female. Okay, the repressed female as being the mad woman who is in the attic, who is not accessible, who one does not want to access. Okay, and who is labeled a mad woman. Okay, only because of her subversive potential. Okay, then we have Luce Irigaray, a French feminist critic, who propounded the theory of écriture féminine, or feminine writing. Okay, writing which celebrates she writing that celebrates a particularly female way of writing, and these are some of the critics who early on had established the field of feminist literary criticism. Okay, so but this is not really the entire story of feminist literary criticism. Okay, of course is even within this discourse we find that there were many feminist critics who in the larger cultural domain, okay, for instance not just literature, in the larger cultural domain sought to look, for instance, we have talked about power and representation, but also issues like popular culture, okay, how are women represented in popular culture, in films, in popular fiction, okay, in theatre for instance, okay, in the media, the representation of you know, women and the attributes of the so called you know, normative woman. These are some of the ways in which feminist criticism looked into the representation. Then also of female subjectivity and feminine subjectivity. Okay, what is subjectivity? Subjectivity is at least vis-a-vis identity. Subjectivity is you know, very simply put, what it is like to be. Okay, what it is like to be, in this case what it is like to be a woman. Right? We may extend this to ask questions like, what is it like to be a woman of color? What is it like to be a woman from a certain region of the world, or from a certain region in India for instance? Okay? What does it mean? What are the feelings? What are the you know, what are the understandings and what are the experiences of being a woman in a certain condition? So, the subjectivities particularly were, the study of subjectivities was particularly also helpful for the study of literary texts, okay, and particularly say characters in novels, or you know, female persona in poems for instance. Okay, so how did it feel? You seem to get a direct in a look, so to speak, into the inner life of a woman. Okay, there is an interesting book that I had read by Rama Mehta, Inside the Haveli. Okay, so the Haveli, or so if you look at you know, other communities in the world like Zenana for instance. Okay, what does it mean to be? What does it feel like to be under a system of what we call parda, or what does this feel to be like a woman performing certain chores inside, or having certain clear cut behavioral you know, norms inside a haveli. Do you follow? Okay. So, these are some of the you know, these are some of the richer areas in which feminist criticism found that they could talk a lot about. Consumption also in popular culture, consumption, what do women consume? Okay, what are women allowed to consume, and what kind of things women are allowed to consume or not at all. And finally, of course, given all these, what are the identities that are given to women? Okay, how is a woman looked at, and how does she perceive her own identity? Do you understand? All these create a sort of a female identity which takes on different colors in different times and different you know, in different temporal situations. Now, I mentioned this, that you know, following the first phase of liberal and socialist feminism, we also came across radical feminism. Okay, there was radical feminism, psychoanalytic feminism, feminisms of you know, based on a difference in color for instance. Okay, and we also have other kinds, like for instance difference feminism. Now I am going to go into that. I mentioned an important point with which I would like to end this talk, which is post feminism. Okay, when we were writing our, you know, doing our PhD work, this was not so much, at least in India, it was not so much in focus really. We were still in the older discourses of Elaine Showalter, Gilbert and Gubar, also some of Luce Irigaray for instance, right. But there is a clear shift here, and this is indicated and by this very word, post feminism. Now, what is post feminist criticism? Does it mean that feminism has ended, or is it like the post in, for instance, post structuralism, where some of the tenets of structuralism lead to a post structuralist approach? Okay, post feminism is a post enlightenment discourse. Now, for this again, obviously we have to go back to a term like enlightenment. And what is enlightenment? Enlightenment is a way of thinking. Enlightenment is an ideology, enlightenment is also a historical period, okay, in which the belief in you know, the belief in the potential of science, of technology, of reason and rationality, okay, was paramount, and it was a discourse in which everything was seen as being able to be conquered, so to speak, able to be accounted for, so to speak, by science, reason and rationality. Okay. So, many critics are of the opinion that these what they call grand narratives or these grand stories, for instance, are given to us by Marxism. And you know, Marxism is is a macro theory of of accounting for the structure, as you saw, the structure and change in societies. Okay. Religion again is another such grand theory. Do you follow? Okay. So, these are some of the ways in which there was a certainty, but in post feminism we find, which also called queer studies, that the difference between sex and gender is problematized here. Okay. Well, some of the main things here is the problematization of the sex gender dichotomy, the importance of representation in sexual identity, discourse and gender, biological truths are access to discourse. This is very important. If you look at the difference here, even biology, we saw that when we defined gender as being not sex, here in fact also the certainty of sex, the certainty of a biological identity is questioned, and it is said that biological truths are also a matter of discourse. Okay? And the function of regulatory ways of speaking in the formation and determination of the sex bodies. Okay? The regulatory, following writer like Foucault, for instance, the regulatory practices and make up a gendered being. These are some of the important aspects, which again are feminists, all right, but are post feminists in the sense, for instance, what the post feminist critic Judith Butler tells us, that gender is not our only identity. As partakers of other domains and discourses, we both belong to and not belong to particular discourses. And finally, she says gender is always a failure, an accumulative fact of social relations that have become naturalized over time. She also says that this is the most important point, the gender, if you think you're masculine or feminine, it is an illusion. First, she says it's a failure because it is an unattainable ideal, and it is also an illusion of an abiding gender itself. If you think that I am feminine, then it is an illusion for the post feminist. Why? Because as she says here, read this, the effect of gender must be understood as the mundane ways in which bodily gestures, movements and styles constitute the illusion of an abiding self. Gender is an effect. It is an effect that is reiterated over and over again, so that it seems natural to us. Okay? It is a performance, the series of performances that are done by us. So, there is nothing ontological or essentially feminine, even in a feminine person, okay? So called feminine person. Therefore, it becomes a critique of traditional feminism. Do you follow? So, from a queer studies perspective, okay, we then look at the regulatory practices and those silences and gaps in the text. Okay, when you're looking at a female, character, okay, how certain attributes that are neither male nor female are sort of silenced in the text, and also silenced by the way we read the text, and we miss those gaps in the text. Do you understand? Certain situations, certain episodes, events, lines in the dialogues given to them, these are certain potentials that we have missed. So, this new school or this new school of feminism exhorts us to look into those gaps and silences and to see these things as not given, but as something that is an effect, okay, much in the post structuralist manner. So, this is really, as I had said in the beginning, a very elementary way of looking at gender. I tried to show you how gender, the traditional way of liberal and social feminism gave way to feminist critics and writers, theorists who wanted to move away from the male defined theories and have their own theories via radical feminism, for instance, a feminism, of feminism of difference and feminism of color, for instance, right. So, for instance, if you get a question, let's see what kind of questions you may get here. If you are asked a question, right, why was what were the early breakthroughs made by feminists, and then you would say that it is held that liberal feminism and social feminism, which borrowed from the discourses, okay, which borrowed from the already existing liberal and socialist or Marxist discourses that were already created by men, and then replaced a certain class, economic class with the female gender. Okay, these were the earlier discourses of feminism. Okay, and then if the next question, if you say what are the interventions that were made by women, by feminists, by these theorists, okay, to carve out a niche or carve out a whole, not just not a niche, to carve out really a whole a wholly opposite and a counter sort of discourse to the main discourse, that was to the male discourse. Okay, and then you'd say that feminism really broke is not the word here, really carved out several areas and several approaches and orientations, like psychoanalytical criticism, which was against the Freudian castration complex or Oedipus complex models of looking at men and women, understanding even children or characters in novels. Okay, and a far more nuanced way of looking at women through psychoanalysis. Then radical feminism, that the way women began to talk about the differences within feminism. Okay, the clear dismissal of a homogenized subjectivity of what it means to be a woman. Okay, because there are other variables here. There's a variable of class, variable of caste, of race, for instance, and sexual orientation, right? Following the LGBT movement, the gay activist movement, for instance, these have completely done away with the fact that the female experience is simply a homogenized experience, or all over the world, throughout different parts of the globe, right? Then next is what is patriarchy? Patriarchy is divided into two words, the root words. Pater meaning father, and archy or rule of or rule by. Patriarchy is basically an ideology, it's a worldview. Okay, it is a power structure, right? Patriarchy is also ways of representation, and patriarchy also is the way our material lives are concerned. And how does it help a feminist literary criticism? These understandings help a feminist literary critic in trying to explore, okay, how A, for instance, women are represented in a literary text, B, what are the power dynamics between or among characters in a literary text, okay, what are the details of power dynamics in the material lives of the characters, and the subjectivities of female characters, and also male characters, identities they are given. Then also, as I said, looking at popular culture, not simply canonized literature, looking at popular culture. Finally, we end by asking a question on post-feminism. Why do we have at all a feminist literary critical school known as post-feminism today? This came about with a clear attack on the earlier division of sex and gender, the differentiation between sex and gender, as sex being completely physical, physiological, and biological, and gender being more of a social construct. Critics like Judith Butler said that even sex, that is biological definitions, descriptions, are couched in a certain discourse. Okay? So, sex cannot be completely a biological thing. Sex is also a discourse. Okay? So, again redefining the boundaries between sex and gender. If gender is a discursive activity, so also according to these critics is sex. Okay? So, let me end here, and I hope this was useful to you. Again, let me remind you, this is an elementary lecture. Those of you who are interested may go on to look at various aspects. Today, the scenario is very different from what it was before. It is a scenario in which you have a plethora of analytical tools, an extremely exciting time to be doing feminism. Okay? Thank you.